With the bonfire lit, the story begins. 72 Hours in Hell, the forbidden Russian experiment. Russia. In 1954, in an underground laboratory in the Soviet Union, 5 political prisoners are subjected to a secret experiment, remaining awake for 30 days under the influence of an experimental gas. The goal? Create the perfect soldier, immune to fatigue and fear. But after 72 hours, something starts to go wrong. Scientists watch the prisoners through cameras and listen to their disturbing whispers. But when silence takes over the observation room, fear sets in. What starts as a simple experiment turns into an unimaginable nightmare. Now locked up with something beyond human understanding, scientists must decide, open the doors and face the creature they created or seal the laboratory forever. The Soviet Union, 1954. The Cold War was intensifying, and the government was desperately searching for ways to create the perfect soldier. Something that didn't need sleep, that didn't feel fear, that was just an instrument of war without human limitations. This is how the Projeto Noshnik, the secret experiment, would be conducted in an underground bunker, far from any prying eyes, far from any possibility of escape. Dr. Viktor Ivanov knew he was entering dangerous territory when he received the summons. His background in neurological studies and sleep deprivation experiments caught the attention of the KGB, and he had no choice but to accept the mission. Upon arriving at the isolated military complex, he was greeted by officers with cold expressions and clear orders. The experiment cannot fail, you cannot fail. 5 political prisoners were selected for the test. They were considered traitors to the country, people of no value to the regime. The oldest of them, Sergei Mikhailov, was a former soldier. The others included a young college student named Dmitry, a bank robber named Anatoly, a dissident writer named Yuri, and a mysterious man, his face always hidden by shadow, known only as Oleg. The testing chamber was a cold, claustrophobic space, with no windows, just a small reinforced glass opening for observation. As soon as the prisoners were sealed inside, the experimental gas began to be released. Initially, it seemed harmless. They talked normally, discussing their lives and trying to maintain a good mood. Victor observed everything carefully, registering the first effects. Us first 2 days, everything went as expected. But he already knew. The terror was yet to come. So in the early morning of 3rd day, something has changed. Sergei, the former soldier, stopped answering the others' questions. I would stare at the ceiling for hours, without blinking. Yuri, the writer, began to scribble words on the floor with his nails, muttering disjointed sentences. Dmitry and Anatoly began to whisper among themselves, looking at Oleg as if he were a stranger, as if he wasn't there from the beginning. Scientists monitoring the experiment began to notice strange details in the audio recordings. There were noises that did not come from the prisoners, little whispers as if other voices were present in the room. The cameras only showed the 5 men, but over the speakers, there was something more. Victor tried to justify everything with rational explanations. The gas could be inducing hallucinations, perhaps an unexpected neurological response. But a nagging feeling settled in the back of his mind, a primal instinct that he tried to ignore. And then, exactly at 3:33 a.m. on the 4th day, one of the prisoners began to scream. It was no ordinary scream. It was something deep, cutting, as if the pain itself was something physical escaping his throat. The others didn't react. They just looked at him, motionless, as if they already knew what was happening. And then, the scream stopped abruptly. Absolute silence. Outside, the scientists looked at each other, and Victor realized a terrible thing. For the first time since the experiment began, he no longer wanted to know what would happen next. The silence that took over the chamber was not normal. It was a calculated silence, as if the prisoners knew exactly what they were doing. Victor watched the monitors, waiting for someone to speak, for someone to react to the terrifying scream. that had echoed just seconds before. But nothing happened. "Are they awake?" asked one of the assistant scientists. Victor nodded without taking his eyes off the screen. Yes, they were awake, but it was as if something in them had changed. The only form of communication was a microphone inside the chamber. When Victor activated it, his voice was muffled by the old system. "Dmitri? Yuri? Can one of you report what happened?" For long seconds, just static. Then a faint laugh filled the room. It was Anatoly, the thief. His voice was drawn out, hoarse, as if he was holding himself back from bursting into laughter. "Why do you whisper? If you know we can hear everything." The scientists looked at each other, whispering. No one out there was speaking quietly. "I don't understand, Anatoly. What are you talking about?" asked Victor. The man laughed again. This time the other prisoners accompanied him. First, a slight murmur. Then, a growing, uncontrolled laugh. A laugh without any humor. A laugh Victor would never forget. And then at the same time, they stopped. "We know what you want," said Yuri for the first time. "And we know that they are not ready to see what lies beyond sleep." Victor felt a shiver run up his spine. This was not part of the protocol. None of this was predicted in the experiment. Meanwhile, on camera, something disturbing began to happen. The 5 prisoners stood up at the same time, slowly walking to the chamber wall. And then, they turned to face the camera. They didn't say anything. They just stayed there, looking directly at Victor. And that's when he realized something horrible. The 5 of them were smiling. The prisoners' smile was a grim cut across their pale faces. It wasn't a human smile, but something forced, as if his muscles had been twisted to form that grotesque expression. Victor felt his breathing quicken. That one, it wasn't normal. "What the hell is happening to them?" muttered one of the assistant scientists. The audio feed remained open, but the prisoners said nothing more. Just they looked at the cameras, motionless, smiling. "Hallucinations," suggested one of the doctors. "The gas may be affecting the prefrontal cortex, altering their perception." But Victor knew that it wasn't just a brain change. Their behavior wasn't just a side effect of the experiment. They knew what they were doing. And then, exactly 4:44 in the morning, Sergei, the ex-soldier, stepped forward. For the first time in hours, he said, "You can see us, but can you hear us?" The radio crackled. The sound of static filled the observation room. "I can hear you," Victor replied hesitantly. "What's going on in there?" Sergei tilted his head slightly to the side like a curious animal. His eyes were black, not as if his pupils had dilated, but as if there was no longer any white in his eyes. Just absolute darkness. "The door is still locked, right?" he asked in a calm, almost casual tone. Victor's heart stopped for a second. "Yes," Sergei smiled even wider. "Much more. So we are safe. For now." And then he went silent again. Victor felt a cold sweat run down his forehead. Something was wrong. He turned to the monitors, analyzing the prisoner's vitals. What he saw made his blood run cold. The heartbeat was abnormal. Each prisoner should be demonstrating clear signs of extreme fatigue after almost 100 hours without sleep. But instead, their bodies were adapting. Everyone's heart was beating irregular but efficient, as if the gas wasn't just keeping them awake, but transforming them into something different. Then Sergei's monitor blinked. His heartbeat simply stopped. Victor opened his eyes wide and looked at the cameras. Sergei was still there, standing, smiling, but his heart had stopped. The scientists froze in front of the screen. Sergei's monitor showed a straight line, indicating clinical death. But there he was, standing, looking directly at the camera, smiling as if he knew something they didn't. "This is not possible," muttered one of the doctors. Victor refused to believe what he saw. He checked the equipment. Perhaps it was an error in reading vital signs. But when he expanded the data, he noticed something even worse. The 5 prisoners were showing the same pattern. Their hearts beat slower and slower. But they did not faint. They did not show any signs of suffering. They were beyond sleep. Victor pressed the radio button. "Sergey, can you hear me?" For a moment, silence. Then something happened. The camera lights began to blink. The cameras recorded a strong interference as if an electromagnetic field was distorting the environment. And then, the microphones captured an impossible sound. Voices, but not the voices of prisoners. They came from all corners of the chamber. Some whispered in unknown languages, others murmured something incomprehensible, and others just laughed. And then, Sergey finally responded. But it wasn't his. What came out of the speaker was a choir of mixed voices speaking at the same time, each in a different tone. Some hoarse, some childish, some so low they made the radio vibrate. "He's awake." The scientists instinctively backed away. "Who's awake?" Victor asked, feeling his throat dry. The prisoners laughed, not synchronously, but as if everyone was hearing a different joke. And then, Sergey pointed to the camera. "You're about to find out." The exact second he finished his sentence, all the lights in the bunker went out. The laboratory was plunged into absolute darkness, and in the terrifying silence that followed, the microphones picked up one last sentence, one whispering voice so low that it seemed to be inside Victor's own brain. "Do you think you were the first to find us?" The entire bunker was plunged into darkness. The monitors flickered before turning off completely. Emergency alarms failed. Everything was silent. For a brief moment, Victor was paralyzed. Something was wrong, very wrong. The scientists around him began to move blindly, muttering worriedly. The emergency lights should have been activated immediately, but nothing happened. "Restart your system now," Victor ordered, trying to remain calm. The seconds seemed to drag by. The only sound in the lab was the crackle of radios trying to reconnect. And then, the camera microphone chirped again. Victor turned around, feeling a chill run up his spine. The monitoring screen was off, but the audio was still transmitting. Something. It was a wet sound, something moving in the chamber. And then, a scream pierced the silence. But it wasn't a normal scream. It was something cruel, superhuman, as if several voices were shouting at the same time. The sound made the speakers explode with static noises. The scientists, they shouted, covering his ears. One of the assistants fell to the floor, shaking. Another tried to cover the radio with his hands, but the voice vibrated by the environment itself, as if it were inside the walls, and then stopped. The bunker was silent again. Victor took a deep breath and forced himself to ask, "What the hell was that?" The hazard lights finally came on, blinking faintly. The monitors were reset, showing a blurred image of the test chamber. But something was different. Before the blackout, the 5 prisoners were standing motionless. Now only 4 remained. Oleg had disappeared, but the chamber door was still sealed. Scientists tried to redo the recording to understand what happened during the darkness, but the files were corrupt, as if something had erased those minutes from existence. It was then that Victor looked at the remaining prisoners. They were still standing still, looking directly at the camera. But now their smiles were gone. For the first time they looked terrified. And then Dmitri, the youngest of them, murmured something, almost inaudible. Victor turned up the volume. "He's here." And then, without warning, Dmitri looked up, as if something were on the ceiling of the chamber. But there was nothing, or at least nothing that humans were capable of seeing. Dmitri continued to stare at the ceiling of the chamber, his eyes wide, his lips trembling. The other prisoners did not dare move. Oleg had disappeared before them, and now it seemed they knew something the scientists didn't. Victor felt his throat go dry. He looked at the monitors, searching for any logical explanation, but there wasn't. The chamber was sealed. There was no way Oleg could have just disappeared. Review the recordings frame by frame. I want to know exactly what happened in the seconds before the blackout. One of the video technicians quickly accessed the files, attempting to restore the corrupted data. For some reason, the blackout only affected the test chamber. The rest of the bunker was functioning normally. Victor approached the screen when the technician managed to retrieve a single frame of the recording. The frozen image showed Oleg, but he was no longer whole. His feet were still on the floor. His legs remained there, but his torso and head were tilted back, as if something invisible was pulling him by the skull. And then the image became completely distorted, as if she had been captured at the moment Oleg was snatched away of reality. This is impossible, one of the scientists whispered. Victor felt cold sweat run down the back of his neck. There weren't enough forces to pull an entire man out of a room without leaving a trace. But what if whatever was in there never needed to use force? On camera, Dmitri was still looking at the ceiling. He didn't blink. Dmitri. Victor activated the microphone. What are you seeing? For a moment he thought the prisoner would not respond. But then, Dmitri opened his mouth and laughed. It wasn't a human laugh. It was a sound seco, as if he no longer had control over his own voice. Do you really want to know, Doctor? Victor hesitated. Something inside him he screamed not to respond. Yes, I want to know. Dmitri slowly lowered his head and faced the camera. His gaze was empty. He won't let us sleep because if we sleep, he might come in. Victor felt the hairs on his arms stand up. Dmitri tilted his head, as if he was hearing something the scientists couldn't hear. But now, he doesn't have to wait anymore. And then, for the second time that night, the entire bunker was plunged into darkness. The lights went out again, and this time they didn't come back immediately. The bunker was engulfed in suffocating darkness. The only sound was the scientists' rapid breathing and the clicks of equipment restarting. But then, something changed. The microphones in the test chamber began to pick up a new sound, a snap, one wet noise, as if something was being slowly ripped apart. Victor felt his stomach turn. You knew that this was not a technical error. The monitors flickered back, revealing an image horrible. Now there were only 3 prisoners left. Dmitri was no longer in the chamber. And this time, the camera captured everything. The scientists stared in shock at the real-time video. In the corner of the room, where Dmitri had been moments before, there was something new. One mark on the wall. It wasn't blood. It was a shadow. A dark spot, shaped almost human, but wrong. As if someone was trying to remember what a body should look like. She moved, and then the sound returned. The heavy breathing of someone who shouldn't be there. Victor pressed the microphone button. Sergei, Yuri, Anatoly, are you seeing this? The answer came immediately, and this time, it didn't come from one of the prisoners. It came from the microphone itself. A deformed voice, as if several voices spoke at the same time, in perfect synchronization. We are seeing you. The radio exploded into static, and then the cameras flashed again. The stain on the wall disappeared. But now, something else had changed. Sergei, Anatoly, and Yuri were still in the chamber. But they were no longer facing the camera. They were all looking directly at the door, and they were smiling again. Victor kept his eyes fixed on the monitor. The 3 remaining prisoners, they didn't move. They just stared at the door, as if they were waiting for something. Or someone. The silence in the bunker became unbearable. None of the scientists dared to speak. Nobody knew what to do. Then, without warning, Yuri started laughing. It was a low sound at first, a hoarse whisper which soon turned into laughter. Almost animalistic. The other 2 accompanied him. The 3 prisoners, they were laughing now, their bodies contorting with laughter. But his eyes were filled with terror. They are in shock, muttered one of the scientists. This could be a mental breakdown. Victor didn't respond. He knew this wasn't an outbreak because while the prisoners laughed, the shadow that was on the wall moments before returned. But now, she was on the ceiling. She dragged slowly like a flowing liquid taking shape again. And so Sergei stopped laughing. He turned to the camera, eyes wide, filled with something Victor had never seen before. Absolute panic. Get us out of here, he whispered. The other 2 froze. Their expressions changed immediately. The grotesque smile disappeared, giving way to something worse, a look of pure despair. "Please," Anatoly murmured. "You don't understand. He's inside now." Victor felt a chill down his spine. Something has changed. By days, the prisoners seemed comfortable inside the chamber. How if liked of the experiment. But now they wanted out. "Free us!" Yuri shouted, advancing against the door. "They can't open the chamber," one of the scientists exclaimed. "If the gas goes out, we lose everything." Victor hesitated. The official order was never open the camera before the deadline, but the prisoners were desperate, and something was inside with them. In the shade, no Teto pulsed, and then Yuri disappeared, just as gone. The monitors recorded 0 movement, 0 sound. In a second, he was there. In the other, it wasn't anymore. And in the place where Yuri had been, there was only darkness. Yuri disappeared before your eyes without any explanation. The monitor still registered your vital signs, but he was no longer in the chamber. The only thing that was left of him was a shadow on the ground, as if something had sucked him under. The bee scientists instinctively backed away, their faces pale from pure shock. Victor didn't know how to process this. It was impossible. "This cannot be happening," one of the technicians muttered. "And yet, it is," Victor replied without taking his eyes off the screen. Inside the chamber, Sergei and Anatoly, they were no longer laughing. They stayed standing still, panting, eyes wide. They saw what happened. Then, slowly, Anatoly knelt on the floor and began to write something with your own blood. "My God," Victor murmured. "What is he doing?" The observation room was silent as the cameras captured each letter that he drew on the floor. It was not the gas. Victor's heart skipped a beat. Anatoly continued writing. His finger moved fast, his nails were broken, but he seemed to feel no pain. "We opened something." The scientists looked at each other, fear rising in the air. What did this mean? The gas was supposed to be the only factor responsible for the changes in the prisoners. But Anatoly was saying something much worse. The experiment did not transform them. He opened a door, and then Sergei whispered something. The microphone picked up your voice, low and shaky, almost inaudible. "He's awake," the camera lights blinking non-stop now. The shadow on the ceiling seemed pulsar, as if it were alive. And then, the monitors flickered. By a single second, the transmission was cut off. And when he returned, Sergei, it was no longer there. Anatoly was alone, and behind him, the shadow took shape. 2 hands appeared from within the darkness. And then the monitors went out again, this time forever. The monitor screen blinked one last time before turning off completely. The system no longer recognized no sign of the test chamber. It was as if she no longer existed. "Reset the cameras," shouted one of the scientists. "They don't respond," replied a technician in a cold sweat. "All signs of the camera have disappeared." Victor knew what that meant. The thing inside the chamber no longer wanted to be observed. He stood up slowly. His instincts screamed at him to run. Something far worse than any scientific experiment was happening there. Something that no one could explain. "Doctor, what do we do now?" asked one of the scientists, his voice trembling. For a moment, Victor I didn't know how to answer. He no longer had control over the experiment. They were in the dark, and then the sound of an alarm echoed through the bunker. The testing room was being opened. The scientists looked at each other in panic. "Who is opening the chamber?" Victor shouted. The security assistant was typing frantically on the terminal. "I don't know," the command. "Did not come from us," the bunker speaker screeched. And then, for the first time since the experiment began, an unfamiliar voice spoke through them. "Now, you'll see." Clank. The metallic sound of the locking mechanism was the last thing Victor heard before the chamber door opened. Slowly slide. To the side, the light from the bunker illuminated the inside of the testing room, and what was inside he wasn't human. The chamber door slid to the side, creaking as if it resisted being opened. The entire bunker held your breath. And then, it came out. The observation room was taken over by worst smell Victor had ever smelled. Something rotten, like decaying, flesh mixed with hot iron. An odor old which made his stomach turn. It wasn't Anatoly who was there. Whatever had come out of the chamber, it seemed to have a human shape, but it was wrong. Its members were too long, the joints bent at impossible angles. Your skin was stretched and dark as if she had been burned from the inside. But the worst was the face. There were smiles, several, as if dozens of mouths were sewn into his skin, each one moving independently, laughing, whispering words in languages Victor knew, didn't recognize. And then, she moved. Quick, very fast. Before anyone could react. The first scream echoed through the bunker. The thing grabbed one of the guards by the neck and, with a single movement, he broke it in half as if it were paper. Hot blood splashed on the monitors, and then chaos began. The scientists screamed. Some tried to escape through the narrow corridors, but the doors were locked. There was no way out. Another guard desperately shot the creature. The bullets hit, but didn't hurt her. She slowly turned to him. One of the smiles on the side of his face opened, and he whispered something. The guard started laughing. It was a laugh horrible, uncontrollable. He dropped the gun, put his hands to his face, and took out his own eyes, and then simply fell to the ground, motionless. Victor felt an overwhelming dread rise within him. That was not a living being, era something much worse. The thing slowly turned towards him now. The only sound was the shuffling of his feet against the metal floor. Victor's eyes widened when he realized the creature wasn't coming to kill him. She wanted him to see, and then the lights flickered. For a brief second, Victor saw what was behind her, and his heart almost stopped. There was something bigger, something moving in the darkness. I wasn't alone. The experiment had not only released something, it had opened a door for many. The bunker was a hell of screams and blood, but Victor couldn't move. The thing was before him now, so close that he could feel her hot, fetid breath gnawing at the air. She didn't attack him. The dead eyes without pupils seemed to analyze it. "Why?" he whispered without realizing it. The thing tilted its head, and then, she said, not with a voice, with several. It was like hundreds of people speak at the same time, in tones that varied between despair and tranquility. Some cried, some laughed, some they begged, but they all said the same thing. "You already know what they did here." Victor blinked, his mind slipping into an unbearable daze. And then, he saw. The memories weren't yours. They were from the experiment. Images flashed in his mind. The gas being developed in a secret facility, long before the project was approved. But this was no ordinary gas. The scientists who created it, they weren't trying to prevent sleep. They were trying to open a portal. My God, Victor murmured, shaking. The experiment was never intended to create super soldiers. The gas was designed to keep the human mind awake long enough to cross the barrier between the worlds. And now, something had broken through. The thing smiled once more, and then for the first time Victor realized the real danger. She didn't want to kill anyone. She wanted them to survive, to spread what they learned, to open more doors. And then, the whispers around him became tallest. Something gigantic moved in the darkness of the bunker, something that shouldn't exist, and Victor knew that everything was about to get worse. Victor felt his mind fragmented as the visions consumed him. I was no longer in the bunker. For an instant, it was as if he had been ripped away from reality itself. He saw the past. The first tests with the gas were not conducted in soldiers. They were made in prison camps, on children, on people no one would notice. And then, he saw the first contact. The first man to stay awake for more than 20 days. At first, he resisted. But then he stopped talking. He started hearing things. It started to see things, and on the 31st day, He opened his arms and smiled. "They are here now," he whispered before breaking down in front of the scientists. Whatever was on the other side went through with it, and the experiment was restarted. Now Victor understood everything. What was in the bunker wasn't just a monster, a living door. The prisoners were not transforming. They were being used as bridges. They were the ticket. And now, with the camera open, the whole world was the next step. Victor fell to his knees, suffocating in terror. The thing before him, I knew he understood. And then, for the first time, the creature spoke with only a single voice. A human voice, at the voice of Yuri. "Do you want to know what happens when everyone stops sleeping?" Victor opened his mouth to scream, but then the lights flickered, and the bunker erupted in sirens. Someone activated containment protocol, but it was already too late. Whatever had come out, I was no longer trapped there. He was free, and there was no longer any way to stop what was coming. As sirens du bunker wivavam as a late warning, hell had already been released. Victor staggered back, his heart racing. The air around him was heavy, as if the bunker itself was swallowed by an invisible force. They had to get out of there. Now. "Activate self-destruction," he shouted. "Seal all exits." One of the scientists rushed to the control panel, but the systems were corrupt. "We can no longer control anything." The bunker lights began to blink frantically. The walls trembled as if something is trying to manifest itself within the structure itself. And then, the thing moved again. I was no longer alone. Victor felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as the shadows around the lab began to appear, to grow. Something was coming out of them. The whispers stayed too high, like a cacophony of overlapping voices, all speaking at the same time. And then soldiers began to fall. But they weren't dying. Your bodies were bending in impossible ways, your eyes turning over, your smiles opening up beyond the natural. They were no longer human. They were doors. Victor Mail. He knew that I only had one chance. The emergency protocol could be activated manually, no nucleo du bunker, but to do so he would have to cross the heart of darkness, and he wasn't sure whether I would make it out alive on the other side. The bunker was a maze of living shadows and incessant whispers, but Victor couldn't stop. He ran through the narrow hallways, feeling the darkness closing in around him. Then the air was different, loaded with something that didn't belong to this world. Whatever had gone through it wasn't just a creature. It was a presence, an ancient concept, something that existed long before humanity, long before the first dream. Something you've always been waiting for, and now was awake. Ahead of him, one of the soldiers from the bunker appeared in the hallway. His body shook violently, his eyes completely black. He used to smile, but it wasn't a man's smile. The smile of something that saw Victor as an insect. "Where are you running, Doctor?" The soldier's voice, it was no longer his. It was like a choir of overlapping voices. Victor did not respond. He took out his pistol and shot. The soldier fell, but something came out of him. A shadow. Something formless that dragged itself like a liquid towards Victor. The self-destruct panel was 3 floors below, in the heart of the bunker. But the runners, they were no longer the same. The walls, they seemed to move. The emergency signs now showed strange symbols, as if space itself was transforming. And then he heard. By voice, no longer through whispers, no longer intertwined with others. Now it was sharp, clear, and close. "Why run away, Victor? You already know what will happen." His blood ran cold. The voice came from inside his own head, and then he looked up, and he saw it. The thing had no defined shape, but it had eyes. Many, and every one they looked at him. The presence whispered once again, this time with an almost gentle tone. "When was the last time you slept, Doctor?" Victor didn't respond. I couldn't. He felt something inside him breaking, as if his mind was on the verge of collapse. The thing knew. She was playing with him, but I couldn't give in. His feet moved on their own, driven by pure survival instinct. I needed to get to the control room. The corridor narrowed. The lights flickered, flickering between darkness and something worse. He could already see the security door ahead, the last obstacle. But then, he stopped. The door was ajar. Someone was already inside. Victor swallowed. He knew what that meant, but he had no choice. With hands shaking, he pushed open the door. The smell of blood hit him immediately. Inside the room, the walls were covered in symbols, written with something red and slimy. In the center of the room, sitting in front of the self-destruct panel, there was someone waiting for him. Ira Anatoly. But it was no longer Anatoly. His eyes were black as the void, and her skin seemed to be stretched over a body that was no longer human. He slowly turned his head to Victor and smiled. "I knew you would come." Victor. He felt his sanity crumbling. Why Anatoly? He was writing on the floor with his own finger, and the message was clear. "You're already on our side." Victor couldn't move. It was as if something was holding him there, forcing him to look at Anatoly, the prisoner, or what was left of him. He used to smile. It wasn't a human smile. Was too wide, as if his skin had been pulled to its limits. The black eyes were sunken into the face, but within them, Victor saw something much worse. He saw the abyss looking back. "Do you understand now, Doctor?" Anatoly whispered. "You were always part of this." Victor wanted to deny it. I wanted to scream that it was a lie, that it was all a hallucination. But something inside him knew it wasn't. The truth pulsed around him. The gas did not create the monster. He just opened the door. And he himself had been breathing this gas for days. How long had it been since he last slept? Memories scrambled in his mind. The bunker, the prisoners, the voices. The voices. They had never been just for prisoners. They were in it too. Anatoly stood up slowly. His bones cracked as if his body no longer belonged to this world. "Don't fight it," he whispered. "You know what happens to those who try to escape." Behind him, the self-destruct panel blinked. The emergency counter had not yet been activated. He could still end it all. But what if everything was already inside him? Victor. He felt his own breathing quicken. If he pressed that button, would it really destroy what was on the other side? Or would it free him even more? I had to choose. Now. Victor took a deep breath. His fingers trembled over the self-destruct panel. He had to press the button. But Anatoly, still smiling. "Do you think this will stop us?" His voice was low, mocking. "It will free us." Victor pressed the button. The entire bunker shook. The lights flickered violently as the final alarm echoed through the halls. "The total destruction protocol has been activated." Seconds. The floor started to crack. The ceiling heaven, as if something much larger was pushing from the inside out. The space itself seemed to be falling apart. But Anatoly did not react. Just laughed. "Are you listening, Doctor?" Victor tried to ignore it. I had to run, but then he heard the voices. They were no longer coming from the shadows. They were inside it. Victor stumbled, the sound invading your mind like a swarm of insects crawling across your skin. "You never stopped listening, did you?" Anatoly whispered. "Because you're awake now too." The whispers have grown. And then Victor finally understood. The gas, it wasn't necessary. They never needed the experiment. All they needed was someone who knew the truth. And now, he knew. The counter has reached the end. The bunker collapsed on top of them, but at the last moment before the explosion, Victor could still hear the whispers. And, for the first time, he whispered back. Silence. Oh, bunker, it no longer existed. Tons of concrete, steel, and secrets were buried beneath the explosion. No survivors, no evidence. The Russian sleep experiment has been officially erased from history. But the story, it's not over. Because Victor was still alive. He opened his eyes, feeling the dust and blood on his skin. He was lying in what appeared to be a medical facility. A hospital? A military base? He didn't know. The sounds were muffled. Doctors' voices in the background, footsteps, echoing. He tried to move, but something was wrong. He couldn't feel his own body. Slowly, he turned his head to the side and saw a mirror next to the bed. Your reflection stared back at him. But it wasn't just him. There was something behind him, something that I shouldn't have left the bunker. And then, a voice. Low, dragged, coming from inside him. We never sleep. Victor faced the mirror, the heart paralyzed by terror. Something was back there, something that should not have survived the bunker collapse. But I knew the truth now. The experiment was never about the gas. It was never about keeping soldiers awake. It was about find a passage. Victor era this passage now. The doctors around him talked among themselves, wrote down data on clipboards, checked his pulse. Neither of them seemed to notice what was in the reflection. None of them saw it. Masi. Victor via he listened. And even worse, he understood. The thing behind him wasn't just a monster. It wasn't just an entity lost between dimensions. It was an idea. And now she was inside him. Dr. Ivanov? A voice interrupted his thoughts. A man in a dark. Zuit entered the room, observing him coldly. His accent was American. You went through something incredible, something the world needs to understand. Victor didn't respond. He already knew what came next. Oh, Russian experiment where I am, it was just beginning. It didn't matter how many times they tried to bury him. He would always come back, because humanity was too curious, too arrogant, unable to resist the call of darkness. And now he was the key. He looked at the agent in front of him, forcing a weak smile. And then, in a voice that was no longer entirely his own, he whispered the words that would mark the beginning of it all again. When was the last time you slept?